Today, we're going to take a fascinating journey back over 1,000 years into the Viking Age, not to speak of raids, ships, or legendary conquests, but to focus on something far more intimate and rarely discussed: what it was like to be pregnant during this complex and often brutal time. The Viking world, often characterized by its battles and exploration, held unique social structures and cultural beliefs. But until recently, the experience of carrying a child in that era had remained largely in the shadows of history. One major reason for this historical silence is the lack of concrete evidence. Unlike weapons or ships, pregnancy doesn't leave behind obvious traces in the archaeological record. Graves rarely include clear indicators of a woman's condition at the time of her death. Written records from that era, when they exist, focus far more on heroes and gods than on the daily realities of women's lives. But new findings are beginning to fill those gaps. Let's begin with one of the most striking discoveries from this recent study: a small figurine found in a 10th century burial site in Sweden. This artifact is exceptional not just because it portrays a pregnant woman, but because she is dressed in what appears to be military attire. She wears armor, possibly a helmet, and carries the aura of a warrior. For archaeologists, this finding is groundbreaking. It challenges long-standing stereotypes that viewed pregnant women as passive or fragile figures, solely defined by their reproductive role. Instead, this figurine offers a radically different image, that of strength and agency. It suggests that, in Viking society, pregnancy did not necessarily sideline women from communal life or even from conflict. In fact, the very depiction of a pregnant warrior implies a level of respect and reverence for the power of motherhood combined with martial courage. Could it be that Viking culture had a more complex understanding of womanhood, one where creation and destruction were not opposing forces but intertwined? But the image of the empowered pregnant woman does not erase the very real hardships these women faced. Pregnancy during the Viking Age was incredibly risky. The study points out the high rate of maternal and infant mortality. Yet, strangely enough, joint mother and child burials are very rare in Viking cemeteries. This absence raises difficult questions. Were mothers and their stillborn or deceased infants buried separately? Did social status influence how pregnancy losses were handled? Or do these missing graves reflect a broader cultural reluctance to memorialize such deaths? What we do know is that newborns often entered a harsh world. Archaeological evidence shows that some infants, especially those born prematurely or with complications, were given no formal burial at all. Others were found in atypical places, under houses or near hearths, rather than in cemeteries. This irregular treatment suggests that Viking societies may have had different beliefs about the value or identity of newborns, particularly those who died very young. The emotional and spiritual dimensions of pregnancy also played a role in Viking literature. In sagas, those rich Icelandic narratives filled with mythology, heroism, and drama, pregnancy sometimes took on epic qualities. One tale, cited in the study, tells of an unborn child destined to avenge his father's death. Even in the womb, this child is drawn into a web of vengeance, honor, and duty, core values of Viking culture. Such stories suggest that pregnancy was not seen as a time of passivity, but as a stage full of potential power and future action. Take the example of Freydis, a historical figure immortalized in the sagas and portrayed in modern adaptations like Vikings, Valhalla. In one scene, Freydis, heavily pregnant, finds herself in the midst of an attack. Rather than retreat, she seizes a sword, exposes her chest, and strikes it defiantly, sending a powerful message to her enemies. This bold gesture shocks and intimidates them. The moment is symbolic, not only of resistance but of reclaiming control over one's body, even while carrying a new life. Interestingly, this warrior-like depiction of pregnancy echoes back to the previously mentioned figurine. Both narratives disrupt our modern assumptions about pregnancy as a vulnerable or purely nurturing state. In the Viking imagination, the pregnant body could also symbolize rage, revenge, strength, and defiance. But not all aspects of Viking pregnancy are inspiring. The legal records from the time paint a darker picture. Laws treated enslaved pregnant women as liabilities, referring to pregnancy as a kind of defect or inconvenience. Worse, children born to enslaved women were often considered the property of the enslavers. This dehumanizing legal framework shows how reproductive roles could be weaponized for control and economic gain. Maternity was not just a biological process, it was political. These conflicting narratives, of the fierce pregnant warrior and the exploited mother, highlight the complex reality Viking women faced. They were not just bearers of life, they were also targets of social control, subjects of myth, and occasionally, wielders of power. Their experiences depended heavily on class, status, and context. What stands out most from this archaeological and literary exploration is the resilience required to survive pregnancy in such a time. Imagine carrying a child while living in a society where war, cold, and hunger were constant threats. Where access to medical care was non-existent, and where social expectations could demand both gentleness and violence from the same person. Where your body was at once sacred and objectified, praised and punished. And yet, these women endured. They gave birth in longhouses surrounded by family, in fields, perhaps even on ships. They passed down not only life but traditions, stories, and skills. Whether as farmers, healers, seers, or fighters, pregnant Viking women were integral to the survival and identity of their people. In a time when death was close and life was hard-won, every pregnancy was both a risk and a hope. Through the lens of archaeology, we are only beginning to understand the depth of that experience. And perhaps, in doing so, we also gain a new perspective on the strength it took to be a mother, not just in Viking times, but in any era. As we reach the end of this exploration into the experience of pregnancy during the Viking Age, it's important to take a step back, not just to summarize what we've learned, but to reflect more deeply on what it tells us about the world these women inhabited, and how their legacy echoes into our own time. First, let us acknowledge the silence. For centuries, the experiences of women, especially those related to childbirth and motherhood, have been underrepresented in historical records. This is not unique to Viking history. Across many cultures and eras, the contributions of women, their suffering, and their strength have been deemed less worthy of documentation. In the case of the Vikings, a people remembered for raiding, exploration, and conquest, this silence becomes even more pronounced. The loudest stories have often belonged to men with swords, not to the women who brought new life into an uncertain world. And yet, archaeology is now helping us recover those quieter voices. The discovery of a single figurine, a pregnant woman wearing military gear, forces us to rethink centuries of assumptions. It challenges us to imagine a society where even the state of pregnancy did not exempt women from danger, duty, or agency. This tiny statue, made of metal or clay, opens a conversation not only about the symbolic roles of Viking women but also about their lived reality. It suggests that Viking culture, for all its violence and male dominance, may have held space for more complex identities in which a woman could be both mother and warrior, vulnerable and powerful. We also cannot ignore the harshness of their world. The data unearthed from burial sites tells us that maternal and infant mortality was common. Many pregnancies likely ended in heartbreak. The absence of shared mother-child graves, the irregular burials of babies, and the near invisibility of infants in the archaeological records speak volumes about how fragile life was, and how society may have coped with this fragility. Were these omissions acts of sorrow, shame, ritual, or simply the outcome of practical limitations? We may never fully know. But they remind us that for every figure like Fridas, wielding a sword while with child, there were countless others who suffered quietly, whose names and stories have been lost to time. And yet, these losses do not erase the legacy of endurance. Every Viking child that survived was a testament to the strength of the mother. Imagine being pregnant in an era with no modern medicine, in communities where childbirth was attended by relatives or local midwives rather than doctors. Imagine enduring long winters, food scarcity, war, and disease while carrying new life. This was not an occasional struggle. It was a central fact of existence for countless women. And they survived, not just as individuals but as culture bearers, story keepers, healers, and anchors of family life. The literary traditions of the Norse world add another layer. In their sagas, the womb is not a place of passivity, but sometimes of prophecy, of fate. One story even describes a fetus destined to avenge his father, a dramatic image, yes, but one that reveals how pregnancy could be tied to ideas of legacy and justice. These stories may not reflect everyday life, but they reveal how deeply embedded the themes of birth, death, and honor were in Viking culture. They also blur the lines between male and female roles, showing that motherhood was not always a retreat from public life, but could be deeply intertwined with it. But there's also a darker side to this history, particularly in how the law treated enslaved women. The legal framing of pregnancy as a defect or inconvenience when it came to enslaved individuals shows how women's reproductive abilities could be exploited. Children born to enslaved mothers were treated as property, reinforcing the brutal economic structures that underpinned parts of Viking society. This harsh reality reminds us that the experience of pregnancy varied dramatically depending on social status. While some women might be honored or mythologized, others were dehumanized. So, what does all of this tell us today? It reminds us that strength takes many forms. The Viking woman wasn't just a mythic shield maiden or a tragic figure in a saga. She was a human being navigating a world of expectations, limitations, and dangers. Her resilience was not always heroic in a cinematic sense, it was practical, grounded, and daily. It was the strength to give birth alone or in company, to bury a child and continue on, to perform household rituals, manage farms, or even pick up a sword if the situation demanded it. It also teaches us to question whose stories we inherit and amplify. Viking history, like much of history, has often been filtered through the lens of conquest, power, and male achievement. But the recent archaeological work reveals that a fuller, richer picture is possible, one that centers not just on kings and warriors, but on mothers, healers, and survivors. These stories don't diminish the drama of Viking history. They deepen it. We are also prompted to look at how modern societies view pregnancy and motherhood. Are these roles still too often tied to assumptions of fragility, passivity, or sacrifice? What can we learn from cultures like that of the Vikings, where pregnancy could be represented as fierce, even combative? Could modern portrayals of motherhood benefit from embracing a fuller range of emotional and symbolic meanings? The Viking Age is long gone, but the themes we've explored, resilience, invisibility, transformation, are timeless. Whether a woman was raising children in a 10th-century longhouse or navigating modern motherhood today, the challenges may differ, but the inner strength required is enduring. So as we close this journey into the pregnant past, let us honor not just the warriors on the battlefield, but those who fought quieter, more personal battles. Those who brought life into a hard world. Those whose bodies bore both the burden of birth and the hopes of the future.